Good morning, everyone. It's lovely to be here in the beautiful theaterette of our wonderful Parliament House, a very historic building in a lovely historic part of Sydney. I'm Rosalind Croucher and I'm the New South Wales Information Commissioner, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you here as part of our Right to Know Week celebrations. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my profound respects to elders past and present, and also to acknowledge the traditional lands of all of those who are joining us online today, and to acknowledge any First Nations people who are part of our audience in person or online. Today's event is part of our recognition of International Access to Information Day, which is held every year on the 28th of September. It was established as an initiative by UNESCO 15 years ago and is celebrated by information commissioners around the world and, of course, throughout Australia. We just build a whole week around it. We like to celebrate things properly in this fine state. And it's a global reminder of the fundamental right of individuals to access government-held information. And we use this day and this week as a time to reflect on the importance of transparency, accountability, and public participation in democracy. Being able to access information is not just a legal right, it is a human right and a cornerstone of fair, open and accountable democracy. I like to see it as the flip side to the right to freedom of expression, which is enshrined in Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which Australia ratified 45 years ago. At the Information and Privacy Commission, we see the real-world impact of this right every day in our work. And I would like to acknowledge all of the fine people in the room and online, including my many colleagues from the Information and Privacy Commission itself, and our fellow commissioners in the state world, and our fine records and other public sector professionals. I acknowledge in particular my colleague Sonia Minutillo, the Privacy Commissioner, and the New South Wales Electoral Commissioner, Rachel McCallum, who also stood before you in this role not so long ago. Welcome all, and thank you for your fine, fine work. And Martin Killian, who was with me on a panel yesterday for the Community of Practice of Ethical Behaviours. Thank you, Martin, for joining us yesterday and for being here today. Before proceeding to the highlight of this morning, our brilliant panel, I want to take a moment to commend you all and the dedication of public sector professionals across New South Wales who work to uphold the right to access information. Your commitment ensures that our democratic institutions remain strong, responsive and inclusive. The right to access information, the bookend of that is the obligation to ensure access, because the right to access needs the ensuring access, which is built into the theme of today, which is ensuring access to environmental information in the digital age. Environmental information is critical, and government and the public sector more broadly have lots of environmental information. It helps us to understand and respond to the challenges facing our natural, built and urban environments, from air and water quality to climate data, information on biodiversity and urban planning. And when this information is made accessible, that is the ensuring access aspects of our theme, and the digital bit is the power of the means of doing so, it empowers communities. It enables people to engage meaningfully in decisions that affect their neighbourhoods, to advocate for fair access to green spaces, to hold decision makers to account, and to improve informed decision-making in the future. In the 2025 Solomon Lecture, delivered last Thursday, 25th of September, in Queensland, marine biologist and science communicator Cherie Maris reflected that when information flows from government to the people and back again, extraordinary outcomes are possible. Our event today will consider the theme of Right to Know Week and explore this through perspectives from government, academia, and local councils. I'd now like to introduce our speakers. Dr. Carly Bartlett. You can give a wave. Or you can get up and make a bow, whatever way you'd like to greet our esteemed audience. Dr. Carly Bartlett, a postdoctoral research associate in the School of Law, Society and Criminology at the University of New South Wales Faculty of Law and Justice. Carly's research sits at the intersection of law, science and technology, with a focus on environmental regulation and public knowledge making. Carly's PhD explored PFAS contamination in Australia, examining how environmental problems are understood and governed, and the role of affected communities in shaping public knowledge. Welcome, Carly. Monica Baroni has been the Chief Executive Officer of the City of Sydney since 2006. Under Monica's leadership, the city has implemented the internationally recognised Sustainable Sydney 2030 strategy, achieving carbon neutrality and delivering award-winning infrastructure, public spaces and community programs. Monica also chairs Resilience Sydney, a collaboration of all 33 councils of Greater Sydney to develop and apply a citywide resilience strategy. Steve Hartley is the Executive Director of Green and Resilience Places at the New South Wales Department of Planning, Housing and Infrastructure. Steve leads strategic initiatives that integrate green infrastructure, biodiversity and climate resilience into urban planning across New South Wales. Steve has been instrumental in programs such as Cooling the Schools and Rewilding Sydney, which have added over 172,000 native trees to Sydney's urban canopy. Emma Whale is the executive leader of Adaptation, Mitigation and Data Insights at the New South Wales Reconstruction Authority. With a background in disaster resilience, infrastructure and community engagement, Emma plays a key role in shaping the state's response to climate risks and natural disasters. Thank you for being here today and for your commitment to open government. I'm now delighted to open our panel discussion where we'll explore these themes: environmental information in the digital age, ensuring access, in greater depth with our expert speakers. So let's begin. I'll ask the question. Sorry, this is a bit of a... We did a bit of stage management consultation at the beginning, and the chairs were on the side, and I thought, panel or projection? Panel. So our panel are featured both for you in the room and also for our wonderful guests online. So I'll ask my first question here and then I'll come and join you. So I'm going to ask each of our panel for the answer to a good opening question about what does ensuring access to environmental information in the digital age mean in practice, and why is it so critical now? So I'm going to start with Carly and then we'll just move along our esteemed row and I will join you for the next questions. Carly.
Okay. Thanks, Rose. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming this morning. So I think I'll start by just saying a few simple things about what access to, or ensuring access to environmental information means. And I think principally ensuring access to environmental information will mean something different in different contexts. So what environmental information means, what access to environmental information means, is necessarily going to be different depending on the community that you're dealing with or the particular environmental threat or challenge that you're dealing with. But it's also always going to be about engendering trust. And in order to do that, part of that process needs to be more than just the sharing and ensuring access to information, but also having something that's more of a conversation or more of a collaboration. So some multi-directional engagement with the relevant communities that you're dealing with. And I don't think those principles are actually very different if you're thinking about an analogue age or a digital age. So that's my starting point.
Thank you. So, yes, we are, we do participate in the UN Information Access Week, which is really significant and very important that we do that. But we are also signatories to the Sustainable Development Goals. And so in order for us to actually implement things like that and report back to the highest levels about what the things that we're doing, we absolutely need access to data. So I think in answer to the question, I would say that what it means is that those of us that are working in the public sector truly understand that we are the custodians of this data. We don't own it. It belongs to the community, and it's incumbent on us to think about how we provide that information and that data and that information to the community in a way that is useful for them. And that's obviously a combination of, open data and good data sharing. Recently, the federal government has released its climate risk assessment, the first, I think, significant climate risk assessment report, and its first adaptation report. And what I think I can say with absolute confidence, I don't think there is a single government in this country who has an adequate adaptation plan or enough money to deal with it. We are not going to be able to deal with the challenge that is adaptation unless our citizens are able to actively be involved and actively make decisions about their futures based on good quality data about the impacts of climate change on them.
Thanks.
Emma?
Well, when I was reflecting on this question, I was really thinking from a disaster resilience point of view, which is the work that the Reconstruction Authority does. And for me, it's quite simple. It's about better decision making. And that's at all levels, right from a community member who needs to understand their risk to a natural hazard so that they can better prepare for what to do when that occurs, through to local government, industry, state and federal government, being able to make better decisions around how we are resilient to disasters and how we can, better prepare, prevent, mitigate, and then ultimately recover and reconstruct. It's all really very dependent on the best available information being available to everybody.
Thanks, Emma. And Steve?
Thanks, Roz. I like going last. I think it's great because I can literally pick up on everything that people have said. And I think what's been said so far, Monica highlighted it best. When I was reflecting on this question, I work in Department of Planning, and so planning is very much about the balance of social, economic, environmental and cultural values in making a decision. Planning decisions have impacts now and impacts into the future. And the longevity of those decisions means that there's uncertainty. So we try and use the best information possible. So when I was reflecting on the question, to me this was about access. I think we've got a wealth of information that's generated almost weekly, and reams of environmental data coming out of the academic sector, out of government. There's studies, there's all sorts of different pieces that are available to people. But the availability and the access is what's critical. Is that information actually digestible? Is it understandable? Is it comparable to the information that you're using? What's the levels of uncertainty associated with that information? As Emma has said, your decision is only as good as the information that you put in. So it's great to have published information, but I think that accessibility, the usability, the understandability and the applicability of that information is really, really critical to informing those decisions, especially in the type of space that I work in, where there's always going to be uncertainty inherent in the decision over time.
Thanks, Steve. Now, I know you said you like to go last, but I'm going to give you and Emma the chance to pick up on the next question. I think, Emma, I'll ask you to go first. And now Steve likes to follow. He can follow you in this one.
He can agree with me.
Sure.
Emma, how does providing environmental information and data sets digitally and widely accessible online affect decision-making by government, academic research, and emergency and recovery response?
So being able to access that kind of information, and I'll come from a recovery point of view in the first instance. So one of the key roles that the Reconstruction Authority plays is coordinating that recovery space after a disaster has occurred. And being able to quickly understand what the impacts are, right from the very individual impacts for, communities, for houses, through to what sort of assets, the state-owned assets, federally owned assets, and how they've been affected in a disaster event, is critical, both from, making decisions about where do we put our recovery centres, where do we, right in the very first instance, make sure that people have got access to the services and the kind of things that they need in that very immediate aftermath, right through to what kind of recovery packages or financial assistance packages are we designing to make sure that we're really providing the community with what they need to get back on their feet. So being able to quickly get that information, and it comes in all sorts of different forms. It might be impact assessment data that the SES would collate, right through to spatial maps showing flood extents. There's a variety of ways that we can access and use that data, but it's really, really critical, particularly in that recovery phase, to really understand what we need to do for community to help them recover as quickly as they can, and then be able to build in more resilience to moving on to prepare for the next event. Because as we know, with climate change, we are going to have to be incredibly resilient to move forward to that uncertain future that Steve talked about.
And so picking up from there, I think there's a really interesting concept that Emma was just talking about, and that's kind of, there's a wealth of information, but that's the scale that information is used at. So Emma referenced, for example, part of the work that we do together is supporting communities in disaster response. And that's, as Emma said, that's getting the right information to people quickly. I was involved in the Northern Rivers flood response. And one of the biggest challenges was you had people whose houses were flooded out and had nowhere to live. They had to know immediately what their options were, where they could go, whether it was safe to return to get their possessions. There's obviously a huge amount of, in our space, flood, bushfire, natural hazard information. But actually having that information in a digestible format in a meaningful way that's accessible to people is really critical. But that scalability, I think, in considering this question, I think is a really interesting thing. In the Department of Planning, as I said, some of the decisions we make are really big. So one of the projects that I'm actually really proud of that we, I think, did something very unique with the way that we used environmental data was a project in Western Sydney. Let's take a slight diversion to the side. The project is planning out the growth of about 10,000 hectares of land across Western Sydney for the next 36 years. Now, Western Sydney's got an amazingly unique environment. There's a whole heap of biodiversity, threatened species that are only found in Western Sydney. For around 5 years before launching that project, I had staff and contractors on the ground surveying about 3,500 to 4,000 hectares of land, doing plot surveys looking for what species were present. We used that information with a whole heap of different academic institutions to then model the uncertainty about the change in biodiversity over time. Expert elicitation, all sorts of really interesting modelling work that got us to the point where we have this, and it's still online and it's available and we use it daily. We have this amazing repository of biodiversity data that looks at the presence of threatened species across Western Sydney, the distribution, the habitat, the likely change, the zonings of land. It's almost like a Google Maps on speed. It is multiple layers that you can turn on and off and zoom in and out. And why I think that was so interesting is we've set a housing development pattern for the next 36 years in Western Sydney. Underpinning that is a very detailed understanding of the population dynamics of all the species present. We've been able to look forward and understand what that development pattern looks like, but equally understand with that environmental information what the impacts are to those threatened species, and importantly, how to counterbalance those. How do you maintain ecosystem services, ecosystem functionality? That's really complex. That's a really complex situation. But we did that with community. So we have a 10-year Caring for Country strategy with the local Aboriginal land councils and Aboriginal elders and population that builds on that really detailed technical information about reintroducing fire into the landscape. We have worked with each of the 8 local governments or councils in the area to use that information in a way that's meaningful for what they do. We have worked with various different communities about how can they access land, how can they reconnect with their green spaces. So massive amount of highly technical modelled biodiversity information that has fundamentally informed the way, the shape and the use of land over the next 35 to 40 odd years. And so it is a project where I think it's a really good example of that access to complex, long-term data, but in a way that's made accessible and useful to the people who it affects and the people who could benefit from it.
Thanks, Steve. So we had a combination of the recovery space, the droughts and flooding rains aspect, and a bit of sunburnt stuff in there too. And to the predictability issue. And I think that's where I'd like to take it to Monica and Carly. And I might go to Monica first, as you indicated you wanted to comment, Monica, particularly that it's really about how government, local government and academia are currently using environmental data. So in a way, Steve, you took us into the predictability space with all of the planning work in Western Sydney. And I would, from my own perspective, I can see the contributions, particularly of the academic world, to which I was connected for a very long time in the first part of my life, could have incredibly valuable insights, particularly in the use of research based on good, understandable data to inform that predictability space. So, Monica, you did say you wanted to come in on this, so I might sort of flip the order we talked about for the next engagement and wrap in those sorts of thoughts.
Well, I just wanted to make a comment, just following on from the fantastic, contributions that we've just had. And because as you were speaking, I was reflecting on, again, the nexus between the public having access to the information, the data and the information, and then the decision-making process, and how critical that is to making good decisions, as you said, and to taking the politics out of decisions. And as you were speaking, I was remembering after the fires in Victoria, around the 2000-2008 mark, when an area was completely burned out, a community was completely burned out, and Kevin Rudd stood up and said, "We will build back." And everyone who knew anything about the environment shuddered, because all he was going to do was build back a community that was going to get burnt down again. And then what occurred as a consequence, I believe, is that as a consequence of trying to build back, there's no point building back if an insurer will not insure. And so the economy could never recover because the businesses could never get insurance again, because it doesn't matter what politicians say. Insurers have been at the front line of this for decades, and you follow what they will do and you will know. They know what's going on. So it's really critical to, it is also about keeping politicians and keeping people honest. I understand the emotion. I mean, it's too late once there's a crisis. These conversations, which is the whole point of the Sydney Resilience Plan, is about having these conversations way before there's a crisis. Because once there's a crisis and people don't have a sense of where will they build their future home, how will their community recover, you can't have that conversation with people who are traumatised. You have to have had it before and had an adaptation plan in place for that time. And that's the significance of, that's for me the crux of this data and information being in the hands of the community at the right time for those right conversations. I can talk about your question further, but I'll pass to Carly.
Okay, Carly, we want the academic side.
Okay, so we want to think about how is academia using environmental information? In so many ways. I mean, I don't think it's an overstatement to say that access to the sorts of environmental information that are held by governments is absolutely critical to academic research. I even think about when I was at university how often I was downloading things from places like Bureau of Meteorology or Geoscience Australia. It's constant. But in terms of the work that I'm doing now, which is about how technology is used in water governance, I think you can see, even in New South Wales, but also globally, there's a whole range of really clever technologies that are being developed, drawing on a whole range of different data sources. And some of that would be locally collected data that's held by government agencies, and then things like satellite data and remote sensing data. And it's because that information is widely available that these sort of things are able to happen, and a lot of those are collaborations between, say, regulators and academia, and you see that around the world and in spaces like water, fisheries, biodiversity conservation. Just one example.
Thank you. So, Monica, about the resilience aspect, Resilience Sydney, and is there environmental information that feeds into planning from your perspective?
There's mountains of it. I mean, later it'd be good to talk about, though, the difficulty of accessing data and all the kind of reform that probably we need, which we might throw to you, Rosalind, to answer, to enable us to all have access to data in a way that's useful. But I'll just give an example. I mean, the climate adaptation, the climate risk plan that came out from the federal government identified what Resilience Sydney identified more than 10 years ago, and really made it front and centre that heat is probably going to be the biggest natural disaster and the biggest killer, right? So as a consequence of that, Resilience Sydney, one of its programs, is to encourage councils to deal with their canopy and their and greening of their city. There's other things happening, but I'm just going to use that as an example. And of course, we've worked very closely with the state, who've been very, very supportive in this space. So what we know is that, that given the temperatures that people are going to see, the trees are really, really helpful in cooling things down. And so we really need to encourage councils to plant trees. But as I said to Steve many years ago when we were all started to work on this, there's no point, Steve, giving councils money to plant a tree if that tree doesn't go onto someone's asset base plan and someone doesn't have a budget to look after that tree. So that's the first thing. Don't give money out to anyone unless you are sure who is going to be the owner of that asset and who can look after it, right? Then what we needed to do was to map the canopy so that councils could see where they had trees and where they didn't have trees and where they had the opportunity to plant trees. Now, at the City of Sydney, we've got a really sophisticated system around our trees, and if you look on our website, you can see, and we've got some of our wonderful staff here who do this work, you can see every street, every tree, the species, what's going to come, when, all the information about, over time, when that species is not going to be able to survive because of climate change, the species that we will plant, and it shows, the heat on every street and what we're going to do to try to mitigate that heat. The reason that that's really important is because trees are very expensive. You do not want to plant trees that are going to die. And we also need to plant them in the right place. I remember at a council meeting, because, of course, we need to plant trees where people live. But when you've got a dense city, planting a tree where people live sometimes means taking away a car space, right? So I remember council saying to me, well, why can't we just, because, we've got a canopy target, can't we just plant more trees in Sydney Park? Yeah, but how's a tree in Sydney Park going to make a street in Millers Point cool? Like, think it through. And the data and being able to show all the mapping, is the tool. When we say, but this is the street that's going to get to 40 degrees and no one's going to go outside. And older people and vulnerable people are going to die. So this is where we have to plant the tree. the state have done some fantastic work around canopy data, but we do have some challenges with access to that, don't we? The cost of access and the amount of access that councils can have. Thanks.
Right. Well, Emma, I know you're champing at the bit to come in on this one too.
Yeah, look, I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things that Monica's said, because one of the tasks that the Reconstruction Authority has is to do disaster adaptation plans across the state. And the way that we start that process is really taking a region, so we're doing 2 at the moment in the Hawkesbury-Nepean Valley and in the Northern Rivers, and understanding what the regional risk profile looks like, not just now, but to your point, what does it look like into the future? An area might be facing at the moment flood, say, as their biggest hazard risk, but we know that the way that climate change is going and the projections that we have, that heat is likely going to be the biggest risk to a particular region, you know, in 20, 30 years' time. So how do we then use that information to guide investment into the interventions that are going to have make a difference now, but then also into the future is really critical. And I really liked your point about that guiding investment, and also, you know, the land use planning changes that might be necessary to make sure that we're protecting people not just now but into the future. And inviting the community into that conversation is really, really critical. And an example of that is in this process of doing the disaster adaptation plan within the Hawkesbury-Nepean, is that we were able to share the risk information with the community, and in particular we had a community panel which was a representative group of people from right across the valley, and show them, you know, if we put an intervention in place like a levy in this particular location that protected a community or a suburb but had a disbenefit to another community, is that something that would be acceptable? And the answer was no. And so we were able to then really understand, using that evidence base, well, these are the values that people hold, and how do we design interventions and design plans that respect the values that people have in place. And so I think it was just a good example of how that nexus between, you know, community, evidence and decision making is just really important.
And I might... Sorry, Rose.
Go in.
Yep.
Go ahead.
I might pick up on that because, look, it's such a fascinating point. I think we're talking about digital information, and I think the power of digital information is being realised by everyone and continues to change. I think people generate a wealth of information. Others see it and go, oh, wow, I can purpose that for something that I've never thought of before. An example in our case is we have recently published some requirements around how to manage flood impacts in Wainemata South Creek. South Creek, really interesting catchment. There's existing development. There's areas that have been set aside for flood management, etc. But being able to utilise new digital information, what we've actually started to be able to look at on a local level is what Emma was talking about, not just what's the impact at a point, but what's the impact in an area and what's the impact over time. And so for the South Creek work, the cumulative impact work that we did, we actually looked at, okay, we've got an existing development pattern, we've got future development rights, we've got floodways, we've got climate change. So if you start to allow people to do certain things, put in hard surfaces, change where the roads are, whatever it might be, what does that actually mean for people who are living there at the moment? And so that's something even 10 years ago, that micro-scale modelling of impact and flow-on impact is, you know, something that's actually really interesting when you start to think about the temporal nature of decisions. So the ability to utilise environmental data in different ways to understand not just consequence but flow-on consequence means that when you do get to things like the disaster adaptation plans that the Reconstruction Authority is preparing, you've got a wealth of information to understand risk and consequence. And you've got a really sophisticated way to do that because you can understand feedback loops over time as well. Something that I think is just really exciting.
Can I just add, just because I made the point about no one's got an adequate plan, but no one has the money for this. And at some point we have to use all of this data to look at the way we are going to raise the money to pay for adaptation. So recently, I know thankfully, after much persuasion did support Sydney Water to increase to put up its prices to pay for the infrastructure that we need to make Sydney Water resilient. It's not. I don't think it's as much as they sought, but that was a lot of people were very actively involved in encouraging IPART. Well, all of us wrote our submissions to support that, because we can all see that the water infrastructure will be inadequate if we don't do it. IPART. I mean, we've had some very good conversations with IPART around, I guess, resilience funding, like a resilience levy. How are we going to raise the money to pay for the adaptation, the infrastructure? I mean, just in the city of Sydney, when it rains, I'm sure you see, because the rain comes down heavy, none of the drainage infrastructure copes. The water bubbles up from the drain, it bubbles up through the manholes, because the rainfall pattern has changed. But there's not enough money in the world to dig up all of the CBD and augment those pipes, right? So, this is also going to lead to being able to make a case for how we're going to raise the money for this.
Thank you. I think you're bringing us down to earth in a very big way, Monica. But while you're on a roll, perhaps we could talk about the biggest barriers that communities face in accessing and understanding environmental information. This has been a theme that Steve, I think you particularly focused on, about the having information is one thing, but it's the accessibility, digestibility, understandability that is crucial. So looking at the community angle, Monica, what are the biggest barriers for communities?
Well, I'm going to start by saying the first thing is, us as public servants and, understanding that we're responsible and accountable for this. So at the City of Sydney, we make a statement to the effect that, we are committed to the accessibility of environmental data at our highest strategic plan. It then cascades through our operational plan, all of our business plans. We have a fantastic team of people, some of whom are here, who make it their mission to ensure that data is available and in a form that works for people. And then, of course, we hold ourselves accountable by publishing every year our Green Report, which reports on everything that we do and measure, even if we're failing. So, for example, here's the graph that shows our emissions reduction profile. And the big drop, of course, is when City of Sydney bought 100% renewable electricity. And then here's our tree planting graph, right? So basically, the first barrier is if we don't do our jobs and absolutely articulate what we understand to be our responsibilities and our obligations and our commitment, and then cascade that right through to delivering and then reporting. I think the other thing is that I know our resilience team wrote me a fantastic briefing note coming into this, where they basically scheduled all the different sources of data that we would like access to, but that we can only get through asking the provider or through relationships with the provider, and sometimes we can't get that at all. So I think the other barrier is the fact that there's mountains of data, but we all have to do a good job of determining who holds it, ensuring they continue to hold it. I think the thing that frightens me with government data is that, this is going to keep going as long as Steve's there. But there can be a change of government, or there can be a change of priority, and suddenly a set of data like the canopy can suddenly not be available. And we've seen this happen, right? We were relying on something, but it's not embedded in legislation or in somewhere that ensures that it will always be collected. So having confidence that if somebody is the custodian of the data, that continues is really important. And then the other issue we have is around, people being concerned about liability and other things. No data set is perfect. There are going to be, issues with it. But people are, we're certainly coming across people saying, no, we're just not going to let you have the data. We're concerned about it. You can't use it, or the cost of it. So there are lots of barriers in the system that we as public servants can do something about.
Thank you. Now, Carly, I know that you've got a lot to say on this area in terms of, what have you seen in the academic space? And there are so many themes that are emerging from this conversation so far.
Definitely. First, just to jump on what Monica's saying about systemic reasons why data can get lost or missing. I think I've seen in my research even, you don't even need to have big changes happen and then you lose access to data. An individual person in an organisation might be the one who's building the infrastructure around a particular data set, and if they leave, if those processes are not institutionally embedded, which they're often not because there might not be enough funding to have someone who's dedicated to maintaining a data set, you risk losing them. So it's also at a much smaller scale. Thinking about the barriers that communities in particular might face, I think everyone's already touched on the sorts of things I'd like to say. So the first one is about how information is presented, the means of disclosure, the form of disclosure, and I think Steve's already touched on this. That's going to be different for different communities. But because different communities have different characteristics, different identities, different histories, they're dealing with different environmental threats. But how do you know how to present information to a community? You need to have that genuine, multi-directional dialogue, and we've heard some kinds of examples of that already, especially from Steve and Emma. And I think that links to a second barrier which I've seen, which is communities sometimes not being taken seriously as sources of knowledge themselves, as legitimate sources of information and of knowledge. And when you do have a multi-directional engagement with communities where you recognise the legitimacy of the sorts of local or culturally specific knowledges that those communities are creating, you also have an opportunity to have input not only in how you share data, but actually in the production of environmental information in ways that are beneficial. And I'll give you an example. This is not from my work. There's an academic in the United States called Gwen Ottinger. She's worked for decades with fence line communities who live around petrochemical facilities. And so something that she's seen is that air monitoring around those facilities was typically done by governments who were measuring average air quality over time. And those results would often be below regulatory limits. But when you actually go into communities, you see the way that they're doing their own monitoring. That's not reflective of how communities experience air pollution. So these fence line communities are experiencing spikes in air pollution where you have very high emissions happening for a short amount of time, maybe minutes or maybe hours, and those things were simply not being captured by the way that states were doing monitoring. And so the only way to actually understand that that's how communities are experiencing air pollution and then respond to that in an appropriate way is to have genuine engagement and to take seriously, for example, the sorts of community monitoring that's happening, even if that might not reflect the same sort of standards of scientific rigour that an expert or a consultant might go out and do. There's so much to gain from learning from communities and their locally specific knowledge. So the conclusion there is that you need to be attentive to the needs of particular communities and recognise them as legitimate knowledge holders in their own right.
Can I? Sorry,
go ahead,
I know,
Steve.
I know
it's fine.
I think that tension, the push-pull between an expert and the data and the community and what it can actually be used for is one that we've got to be very mindful of. Monica's talked a little bit about the program that we run and have run with all the councils across Greater Sydney, the Greening Our City program. It's been running since about 2018 and it's a long-term project that works with all the councils across Greater Sydney to manage urban heat and increase Greater Sydney's canopy. At the start of the project, we had great information. We had satellite flyovers and we had modelling and we had data about where trees were and where trees weren't and hotspots, and we thought, awesome, everyone's going to love this. We went out, we worked with councils, we sponsored and assisted with basically tree planting in areas with low canopy and high heat to try and improve the resilience of those communities. We knew that people weren't getting outside, they weren't utilising their local environment on hotter days, impacts on schools, etc. we know. And we thought, okay, well, it's pretty obvious. Let's go and plant some trees. We went and half of those trees disappeared. What we had forgotten was that we hadn't listened to the community and understood the community's desire. We had communicated, we've got great data, you've got a problem, we're here to solve it. We actually had to turn that around. We got in some behavioural economists. So we had great data, but the communication was where it was failing. And we did 6 months worth of work to understand different community perceptions around canopy. And we were actually turning communities off when we said, A, you've got a problem, you've got lower canopy than other areas and you've got higher urban heat. And the problem, the solution is a tree. And the image of a tree in some communities' minds is this massive, the old eucalypt that's going to drop limbs and squash your car or put leaves in your pool. And we actually turned the conversation around such that the third and fourth years of the program, we didn't talk about trees. We talked about shade, we talked about privacy, we talked about amenity, things that resonated with the community. So we had this brilliant data set and it fell over in the first attempt to apply it because we hadn't properly listened and understood to how the community wanted to digest that information. And if you look at the data that's published on our website, the success of the program kind of went from flatline to a massive jump when we simply used the right language to communicate that complex information with people.
I think that
that's a really good
to,
example.
That we have to be skillful at mediating, right? The data generally, okay, there's some open data which, people are going to enjoy working with and all the rest of it and innovate with, and we have to allow that, right? But at the same time, we've got a responsibility to use and interpret the data and make it useful for people. And I think that's a really great example. But both of you, it's a really great example of why you need to work with people on the ground, which we like to say is local government. I remember 12 trees in Glebe, the number of meetings it took to get, there was an area where we need to put in 12 trees, because we are literally one tree at a time arguing every single tree now, right? And this was, like 3 meetings with the Lord Mayor before we got the 12 trees in Glebe. But every tree counts, right? And every situation counts, and you need to be working with the people on the ground, the community, and understand and in this case, they absolutely, genuinely, sincerely believed that an ambulance would not be able to get to their house if we put the trees in the middle. And we had to bring the ambulance people in to say, don't worry, the ambulance will get to you if we plant the trees, right? So another example, but you need all hands on deck to get that change.
And the tree topic, I'm glad you brought in trees as a specific. We started with canopy and then it got looped into actually about planting trees and several threads and how communities perceive trees. But I was also thinking about trees because of issues of, I think, Monica, you were talking about ownership of assets. Now I'm thinking, well, who's going to be responsible for the tree? And is it one of the sorts, because Australian eucalypts are fabulous things. They're very self-preserving. I think, Steve, you touched on it in terms of dropping limbs. Well, they do. They preserve themselves over time. And I have many of these beautiful things that I attend to at great expense. So there's the ownership of the asset. There's the maintenance of the asset. It's understand, and even talking in language of assets is a little uncomfortable. The beautiful shade givers, but in an urban environment, it is a negotiated space because people are very territorial in an urban environment, and getting that communication to break through in terms of the now, and in 15 years the value of your property will increase by virtue of all of this lovely shade, and the ambulance can get through, and they're not leaf droppers or whatever. But they are negotiated conversations in an urban environment which takes a particular dynamic. So, and that fabulous mapping of the fauna and so on in the area, and the thought about what species to plant, and the longevity of those species and how they respond to climate change themselves in the limb dropping department, which is what you worry about in close proximity to people. There's the expression that they use in the bush is the widowmaker, the tree that drops a limb and and widow someone as a result. So it is part of our country folklore as well. So getting to the question I did want to ask, having spoken about trees, and I do love them, I have lots, especially those beautiful old bloodwoods. There is a need for government to be transparent with the environmental information they hold. We've touched on that need, but now it's the how. How can government manage transparency when there may be uncertainty? And it's the uncertainty issue. Uncertainty surrounding the data or information that is available. So it's that cautiousness, I guess, in the area of uncertain. When is it safe to release information? Is that going to get us into trouble, to put it in the kind of protective public service, perhaps, or political mentality? So would you like to explore that topic? And then, Emma, perhaps you can add some insights.
Yeah, I'll go first. Okay. I think we need to be brave and clear. And I think when we talk about, making risk information accessible to communities, it can be something that we do need to be brave about. And at its very most basic, I was thinking of a conversation I was having with some local councils. You know how you see those sort of poles where they've got markers of where historical floods have been, or, bushfires, etc. That there's a desire in the community to have those because it's a very visible, data point around what has previously happened and, could happen again. And yet there are other, parts of the community that worry about house prices or, insurance costs, etc. Rightly so. But there has got to be, I think, a point where we say people have a fundamental right to understand where they're living, where they're purchasing, what the risk information means to them. And I think that does take bravery. And then I think the other thing about clarity is that it's really important that when we make information accessible, and I completely agree that there are barriers to that, licensing and a whole range of things that we need to address that are quite complex. But it's not also just making the information available, it's also being very clear how was this information gathered? What were the parameters around the information? What's the metadata that's available that we can also give clarity about? Because you might have data that's available for a particular analytical question that really shouldn't be used to answer another question. And I think we've all seen, globally, that what can happen when data is misused. And so I think it's also being very clear about its use case and, then the follow-on of the consequences of how it should be used and how it should not be used. And just another very quick example, if you look at a flood extent map, for example, that gives you a certain piece of information. But when you overlay that with exposure data, where you actually see where people live and where buildings are, you might come to a very different conclusion about what's at risk than if you only had that first piece of information. So I think it's really about, brave and clear were the two things that sprung to mind.
Yeah, look, I would completely agree. I don't think I've got a huge amount more to say. I think one of the really interesting pieces that Emma's just touched on at the end there is I think traditionally we've made information available and we haven't given an understanding of what that information means in the context of its decision. So I think about a planning context, and all councils are required where there's flooding as a risk. All councils are required to have flood maps. It's actually a defence under the Local Government Act where council has published a flood map from being prosecuted if something goes wrong. So they've traditionally been pieces of paper with a line. And I think if you think about like Monica's situation of sometimes there's really heavy rain, sometimes the gutters overflow, a static map with a line on it is not a great representation of the risk that is to that community or that locality from whatever the hazard might be, in this case flooding. And so the ability, A, to digitise that information, but B, to utilise that information in a context that makes sense for the decision you're trying to make. If I'm buying a house and I'm looking at that map and I'm on one side of the line, just by looking at that map, I might go, oh, I don't want to buy that house, that's going to flood. Oh, but over that side of the line, it's fine. Whereas Emma said, it's actually ensuring that people understand the context for that information, because that line doesn't it means something and it's important, so I'm not downplaying that. But in a basic sense, that analysis of one side of the line is bad and one side of the line is good is not correct. It is not useful. And so the ability to utilise information is great, but the ability to know how to use that information in the decision you're making is really, really important if you want people to make the right decisions.
And can I just also say, because you're here, Rosalind, is that, I mean, I don't think we should underestimate the threat to that. I mean, we're seeing that in the United States. We're seeing, right, that at the moment we're living in a world where we're allowed to do all of this, right? But not entirely, because, correct me if I'm wrong, Steve, but there was a planning SEP or whatever that stopped coastal development, right, that was rescinded. Do you remember stopping people building too close to the ocean? So that policy was introduced, and then that policy was rescinded because people screamed enough about the loss of their property values that the minister of the day rescinded the decision. Now, I don't know if that's been put back, but if it hasn't been put back, you still have permission to build your house too close to the ocean, even though we all know it's going to go underwater. So this is already politicized and will be more so the more people recognise. I mean, people are going to be very cross when they discover, even if the line is not accurate, that they're living on the wrong side of the line and what that's going to do to their property value. And so I think, we're public servants, right? And our job is to protect the integrity of this. And we need to think about how we can do that systematically. I think some of these things, I don't know how much is embedded in legislation, but it has to be a duty that we can continue to collect and share this information.
Thank you. Carly, you were going to come in on this as well.
So talking about uncertainty, so my research was about looking at how PFAS contamination grew as a public issue in Australia over the last decade. And I did interviews with sort of over 30 people involved in responding to PFAS, people in government, scientists from all sectors, journalists, people from communities, lawyers. And the main theme that came through with that is this is a difficult issue to deal with because it's so uncertain. There's so much uncertainty. Everybody was saying this. And that was uncertainty principally about health impacts, but also in the context of particular sites of contamination, like Williamtown up at Newcastle near the Defence Base, about the extent and the nature of the contamination itself. And you're probably mostly all familiar with what happened there, but you had a situation where a whole range of government agencies from all levels of government were aware that there was contamination at this site for 3 years before the public was informed. So the justification for that was sort of twofold. One reason being this is too uncertain at the moment. We don't know enough to say anything, and that's in relation to health effects, but also the extent of the contamination, but also this issue around what I've called jurisdictional ambiguity, but there was unknowns about whose responsibility it was to say something. Regardless of why this happened, it's something which provides a very clear example of how having delay in being open and transparent about environmental information fosters distrust in communities, and that dynamic within that community and the relationship between government and the community was always set on this starting point of you knew about this for 3 years and you didn't say anything. And I think there's some things that can be learned from that. There's this unstated assumption, I think, often that communities, and I think we've sort of already heard things from Emma and Steve as well that kind of link back to this, that communities are incapable of processing uncertainty for themselves or making their own assessments about risk. Emma's talked about involving communities in making risk assessments. But research in areas like environmental justice or the public understanding of science show that communities can actually be very good at processing uncertainty and making assessments about their own risk, especially when those decisions are informed by local knowledge or culturally specific knowledge that a state might not have. And can I give one quick example? So this is around blood testing. So blood testing is often something that gets asked for in the context of environmental contamination by communities. It happened at Williamtown. Eventually it was paid for by the state. It's happening in the Blue Mountains now that there's a call for blood testing. It's tricky in relation to PFAS because a GP can't necessarily sit there and go, you have this level of PFAS in your blood, that means X. And so there's a bit of a pushback about we want to protect citizens by not allowing or saying we're not going to fund blood testing because it might be damaging to you, it might be difficult to hear this uncertain information. But when I was having conversations with community members, for instance, just as an example, one younger person said to me, I did get my blood tested because that was information I wanted. I knew it would be uncertain, but my choice was I'd like to have that. I'd still like to have kids. I'd like to have a baseline. In comparison, they said there are other members of their family who said, oh, well, I don't actually want that information. That's not something that I think is useful for me at this point in my life. I don't want to know the answer. But it's only because that information is available that those individuals have the freedom of choice to actually make that decision. And so I think you shouldn't underestimate the ability of communities and members of the public to process uncertainty and risk for themselves.
Thank you. I'm going to have to wrap us up. The conversation I know can catapult us into deeper and wider conversations on so many themes, but I do need to wrap it up. I want to thank everyone on the panel. I would like to ask you to, for one, 2-second soundbite grab, if you were thinking 20 years into the future, because we're looking about foresight, responsibility, trust, and the fragility of it all. And this is really about decision-making and informing decision-making and maintaining trust into the future. So thinking ahead, how would you answer, what does ensuring access to environmental information in the digital age mean in practice in one sentence? And you have to be very quick because I'm getting the wind up all over the place. Steve, I'm going to start with you and I'll end with Carly.
And this wasn't set up, but my answer to this question was actually that in 20 years' time, I'd want to be able to look back and say, regardless of the uncertainty, we made the best decisions that we could at that point in time.
Great answer. Emma?
For me, it's that we've used all this information to price the cost of doing nothing, and we have found a way through that and we have done something.
For me, it's that the community have easy access to the information they need to live their lives safely and to be able to plan for their future.
Carly?
I think monitoring and recording environmental information is all well and good, but we need to be actually taking action in relation to that.
Thank you. And with that, I think we can thank our panel. Thank you everyone for joining us in the room and online. Right to Know Week continues throughout this week until Sunday, so I encourage you to visit the IPC website to find out more and see our available information access resources. And for those of us in the audience today, I would love it if you could join us all for morning tea out in the foyer. So thank you everyone online and thank you in the room.